of the fire, and an unreadable faint smile on her face, she meditated. And she was the most seductive, tantalizing, self-contradictory object for study in the whole of Bursley. She had never been so interesting as in this brief period, and she might never be so interesting again. Mrs. Tams entered. With her voice Mrs. Tams said, "Shall I begin to clear all these things away, ma'am?" But with her self-conscious eyes Mrs. Tams said to the self-conscious eyes of Rachel, "What a staggering world we live in, don't we?" II. Rachel sprang from the Chesterfield, smoothed down her frock, shook her hair, and then ran upstairs to the large front bedroom where Louis, to whom the house was just as much a toy as to Rachel, was about to knock a nail into a wall. Out of breath, she stood close to him very happily. The At Home was over. She was now definitely received as a married woman in a town full of married women and girls waiting to be married women. She had passed successfully through a trying and exhausting experience. The nervous tension was slackened, and therefore it might be expected that she would have a sense of reaction, the vague melancholy which is produced when that which has long been seen before is suddenly seen behind. But it was not so in the smallest degree. Every moment of her existence equally was thrilling and happy. One piquant joy was succeeded immediately by another as piquant. To Rachel it was not in essence more exciting to officiate at an At Home than to watch Louis drive a nail into a wall. The man winked at her in the dusk. She winked back, and put her hand intimately on his shoulder. She thought, "I am safe with him now in this house." The feeling of solitude with him, of being barricaded against the world, and at the mercy of Louis alone, was exquisite to her. Then Louis raised himself on his toes, and raised his left arm with the nail as high as he could, and stuck the point of the nail against a pencil mark on the wall. Then he raised the right hand with the hammer, but the mark was just too high to be efficiently reached by both hands simultaneously. Louis might have stood on a chair. This simple device, however, was too simple for them. Rachel said, "Shall I stand on a chair and hold the nail for you?" Louis murmured, "Brainy little thing, never at a loss." She skipped on to a chair and held the nail. Towering thus above him, she looked down on her husband and thought, "This man is mine alone, and he is all mine." And in Rachel's fancy the thought itself seemed to caress Louis from head to foot. "Supposing I catch you one?" said Louis, as he prepared to strike. "I don't care," said Rachel. And the fact was that really she would have liked him to hit her finger instead of the nail. Not too hard, but still smartly. She would have taken pleasure in the pain. Such was the perversity of the young wife. But Louis hit the nail infallibly every time. He took up a picture which had been lying against the wall in a dark corner, and thrust the twisting wire of it over the nail. Rachel, when in the deepening darkness she had peered into the frame, exclaimed, pouting, "Oh, darling, you aren't going to hang that here, are you? It's so old-fashioned. You said it was old-fashioned yourself. I did want that thing that came this morning to be put somewhere here. Why can't you stick this in the spare room? Unless, of course, you prefer..." She was being deferential to the art expert in him, as well as to the husband. "Not in the least," said Louis, acquiescent, and unhooked the picture. Taste changes. The Rejected of Rachel was a watercolour by the late Athelstan Maldon, adored by Mrs. Maldon. Already it had been degraded from the parlour to the bedroom, and now it was to be pushed away like a shame into obscurity. It was a view of the celebrated Vale of Llangollen, finicking, tight, and hard in manner, but with a certain sentiment and modest skill. The way in which the initials A.M. had been hidden amid the foreground foliage in the left-hand corner disclosed enough of the painter's quiet and proud temperament to show that he "took after" his mother. Yet a few more years, and the careless observer would miss those initials altogether, and would be contemptuously inquiring, "Who did this old daub, I wonder?" And nobody would know who did the old daub, or that the old daub for 30 years had been an altar for undying affection, and also a distinguished specimen, admired by a whole generation of townsfolk of the art of watercolour. And the fate of Athelstan's sketch was symptomatic. Mrs. Maldon's house had been considered perfect up to the time of her death. Rachel had at first been even intimidated by it. Louis had sincerely praised it. And indeed its perfection was an axiom of drawing-room conversation. But as soon as Louis and Rachel began to look on the house with the eye of inhabitants, the axiom fell to a dogma, and the dogma was exploded. The dreadful truth came out that Mrs. Maldon had shown a strange indifference to certain aspects of convenience, and that, in short, she must have been a peculiar old lady with ideas of her own. Louis proved unanswerably that in the hitherto faultless parlour the furniture was ill arranged, and suddenly the sideboard and the Chesterfield had changed places, and all concerned had marvelled that Mrs. Maldon had for so long kept the Chesterfield where so obviously the sideboard ought to have been, and the sideboard where so obviously the Chesterfield ought to have been. And still graver matters had come to light. The house had an attic floor, which was unused, and the scene of no activity except spring cleaning. A previous owner, infected by the virus of modernity, had put a bath into one of the attics. Now Mrs. Maldon, as experiments disclosed, had actually had the water cut off from the bath. Eyebrows were lifted at the revelation of this caprice. The restoration of the supply of water and the installing of a geyser were the only expenditures which thrifty Rachel had sanctioned in the way of rejuvenating the house. Rachel had decided that the house must, at any rate for the present, be made to do. That such a decision should be necessary astonished Rachel, and Mrs. Maldon would have been more than astonished to learn that the lady help, by fortitude and determination, was making her perfect house do. As regards the household inventory, Rachel had been obliged to admit exceptions to her rule of endurance. Perhaps her main reason for agreeing to live in the house had been that there would be no linen to buy. But truly Mrs. Maldon's notion of what constituted a sufficiency of, for example, towels, was quite too inadequate. Louis protested that he could comfortably use all Mrs. Maldon's towels in half a day. More towels had to be obtained. There were other shortages, but some of them were set right by means of veiled indications to prospective givers of gifts. "You mean that Garden of the Hesperides affair for up here, do you?" said Louis. Rachel gazed around the bedchamber. A memory of what it had been shot painfully through her mind, for the room was profoundly changed in character. 2 narrow bedsteads given by Thomas Batchgrew and described by Mrs. Tams in a moment of daring as "flighty" had taken the place of Mrs. Maldon's bedstead, which was now in the spare room, the spare room bedstead having been allotted to Mrs. Tams, and Rachel's old bedstead sold. Bright crocheted and embroidered wedding presents enlivened the pale tones of the room. The wardrobe, washstand, dressing-table, chairs, carpet, and ottoman remained. But there were razors on the washstand and boot trees under it, the wardrobe had been emptied and filled on strange principles with strange raiment, and the Maldon family Bible, instead of being on the ottoman, was in the ottoman, so as to be out of the dust. "Perhaps we may as well keep that here after all," said Rachel, indicating Athelstan's watercolour. Her voice was soft. She remembered that the name of Mrs. Maldon, only a little while since a major notability of Bursley, and the very mirror of virtuous renown, had been mentioned but once, and even then apologetically, during the afternoon. Louis asked sharply, "Why, if you don't care for it? I don't." "Well," said Rachel, "as you like then, dearest." Louis walked out of the room with the watercolour, and in a moment returned with a photogravure of Lord Leighton's The Garden of the Hesperides, in a coquettish gold frame, a gift newly arrived from Louis's connections in the United States. The marmoreal and academic work seemed wonderfully warm and original in that room at Bycars. Rachel really admired it, and admired herself for admiring it. But when Louis had hung it and flicked it into exact perpendicularity, and they had both exclaimed upon its brilliant effect even in the dusk, Rachel saw it also with the eyes of Mrs. Maldon, and wondered what Mrs. Maldon would have thought of it opposite her bed, and knew what Mrs. Maldon would have thought of it. And then, the job being done, and the progress of civilization assured, Louis murmured in a new appealing voice, "I say, Louise." Louise was perhaps his most happy invention, and the best proof that Louis was Louis. Upon hearing that her full Christian names were Rachel Louisa, he had instantly said, "I shall call you Louise." Rachel was ravished. Louisa is a vulgar name, at least it is vulgar in the Five Towns, where every second general servant bears it. But Louise was full of romance, distinction, and beauty, and it was the perfect complement to Louis. Louis and Louise, ideal coincidence. "But nobody except me is to call you Louise," he had added, and thus completed her bliss. "What?" she encouraged him amorously. "Suppose we go to Llandudno on Saturday for the week-end?" His tone was gay, gentle, innocent, persuasive. Yet the words stabbed her, and her head swam. "But why?" she asked, controlling her utterance. "Oh, well, be rather a lark, wouldn't it?" It was when he talked in this strain that the inconvenient voice of sagacity within her would question for one agonizing instant whether she was more secure as the proud, splendid wife of Louis Fores than she had been as a mere lady help; and the same insistent voice would repeat the warnings which she had had from Mrs. Maldon and from Thomas Batchgrew, and would remind her of what she herself had said to herself when Louis first kissed her: "This is wrong, but I don't care. He is mine." Upon hearing of his inheritance from Mrs. Maldon, Louis was for throwing up immediately his situation at Horrocleave's. Rachel had dissuaded him from such irresponsible madness. She had prevented him from running into 100 expenses during their engagement and in connection with the house. And he had in the end enthusiastically praised her common sense. But that very morning at the midday meal he had surprised her by announcing that, on account of the reception, he should not go to the works at all in the afternoon, though he had omitted to warn Horrocleave. Ultimately she had managed by guile to dispatch him to the works for 2 hours, and now in the evening he was alarming her afresh. Why go to Llandudno? What point was there in rushing off to Llandudno and scattering in 3 days more money than they could save in 3 weeks? He frightened her ingrained prudence, and her alarm was only increased by his obvious failure to realize the terrible defect in himself, for to her it was terrible. The joyous scheme of an excursion to Llandudno had suddenly crossed his mind,